It's Friday, January 24th, and this is the International Week of Action to Stop 5G. We are the New York City 5G wake-up call, and we have arrived at the United Nations to present the International Appeal to Stop 5G on Earth and in Space to the United States Permanent Mission to the United Nations. There are, as of January 21st, 2020, 193,830 signatories from 204 nations and territories who have signed on to that. This is a petition to the United Nations to halt what is an imminent disaster that we hope to prevent from unfolding here on Earth and in our heavens.
To the UN, World Health Organization, European Union, Council of Europe, and governments of all nations. We, the undersigned scientists, doctors, environmental organizations, and citizens urgently call for a halt to the deployment of the 5G fifth generation wireless network, including 5G from space satellites. 5G will massively increase exposure to radio frequency, RF, radiation on top of the 2G, 3G, and 4G networks for telecommunications already in place. RF radiation has been proven harmful for humans and the environment. The deployment of 5G constitutes an experiment on humanity and the environment that is defined as a crime under international law. Every person on Earth will have instant access to super high speed, low latency wireless communications from any point on the planet, even in rainforest, mid-ocean, and the Antarctic. But this will also result in unprecedented environmental change on a global scale. The planned density of radio frequency transmitters is impossible to envisage or envision. In addition to millions of new 5G base stations on Earth and 20,000 new satellites in space, 200 billion transmitting objects will be part of the Internet of Things by 2020, and 1 trillion objects a few years later. Evidence that radio frequency, RF radiation, is harmful to life is already overwhelming. The major diseases of modern civilization, cancer, heart disease, and diabetes, are in large part caused by electromagnetic pollution, according to over 10,000 peer-reviewed studies. If the telecommunications industry's plans for 5G unfold, no person, no animal, no bird, no insect, and no plant on Earth will be able to avoid exposure 24 hours a day, 365 days a year to levels of RF radiation that are tens to hundreds of times greater than what exists today, without any possibility of escape anywhere on the planet. Immediate measures must be taken to protect humanity and the environment in accordance with ethical imperatives and international agreements.
5G will result in a massive increase in inescapable involuntary exposure to wireless radiation. The U.S. Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, has adopted rules permitting the effective power of those beams to be as much as 10 times more powerful than the levels permitted for current phones. 5G, from a combined 20,000 satellites in low and medium Earth orbit, will blanket the Earth with powerful, focused, steerable beams. Each satellite will emit millimeter waves with an effective radiated power of up to 5 million watts from thousands of antennas arranged in a phased array. The alteration of the Earth's electromagnetic environment may be an even greater threat to life than the radiation from ground-based antennas. harmful effects of radio frequency radiation are already proven. More than 10,000 peer-reviewed scientific studies demonstrate harm to human health from RF radiation. There is abundant evidence of harm to diverse plants and wildlife. The World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer, the IARC, affirms that RF radiation is a proven carcinogen to humans and should now be classified as a Group 1 carcinogen along with tobacco smoke and asbestos. Furthermore, the placement of these satellites in both the ionosphere and magnetosphere, emitting modulated signals at millions of watts and millions of frequencies, can alter our electromagnetic environment beyond our ability to adapt. They will further pollute the global electric circuit and could alter the Schumann resonances with which all life on Earth has evolved. The effects will be universal and may be profoundly damaging. Regulators have deliberately excluded the scientific evidence of harm. Renowned international EMF scientists who have documented biological effects on humans, animals, insects, and plants, and alarming effects on health and the environment in thousands of peer-reviewed studies have been excluded. Current safety guidelines are based on the obsolete hypothesis that heating is the only harmful effect of EMFs. To protect against non-thermal effects, duration of exposure must be considered. 5G will expose everyone to many more transmissions simultaneously and continuously, day and night, without cessation. New safety standards are needed and should be based on cumulative exposure and not only on power levels, but also on frequency, bandwidth, modulation, waveform, pulse width, and other properties that are biologically important. Antennas must be confined to specific, publicly identified locations.
World governments are failing in their duty of care to the populations they govern. In their haste to implement 5G and to encourage the unconstrained use of outer space, the European Union, United States, and national governments worldwide are taking steps to ensure a barrier-free regulatory environment. They are prohibiting local authorities from enforcing environmental laws, and, in the interest of speedy and cost-effective deployment, removing unnecessary burdens, such as local planning procedures and the variety of specific limits on EMF emissions and of the methods required to aggregate them. Insurers will not provide coverage against EMF risks, and there is zero clarity as to what entity will bear legal responsibility for damage to life, limb, and property arising from exposure to 5G, whether ground or space-based. Legal liability for these activities is non-existent, despite the prospects of whole continents, the atmosphere, and the oceans being put at risk by them. International agreements are being violated. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, taking into consideration the dangers and risks of environmental pollution. The Nuremberg Code 1947 applies to all experiments on humans. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. The World Telecommunications Standardization Assembly 2012 of the ITU stated that there is a need to inform the public of the potential effects of exposure to electromagnetic fields. Resolution 1815, Council of Europe 2011. Take all reasonable measures to reduce exposure to electromagnetic fields. The Declaration of the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment, 1972. The discharge of toxic substances in such quantities or concentrations as to exceed the capacity of the environment to render them harmless must be halted. The World Charter for Nature, 1982. Activities likely to cause irreversible damage to nature shall be avoided. The Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, 1992. States have the responsibility to ensure that activities within their jurisdiction or control do not cause damage to the environment. The United Nations World Summit on Sustainable Development 2002 calls for urgent policy responses to environmental threats to human health. The African Convention on the Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources 2017 requires appropriate measures to protect, mitigate, and eliminate detrimental effects on the environment, in particular from radioactive, toxic, and other hazards. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, presumes the right to life, liberty, and security of person. The United Nations Global Strategy for Women's, Children's, and Adolescents' Health, 2016 to 2030, has objectives for reducing pollution-related deaths and illnesses. In space, the Outer Space Treaty, 1967, requires that the use of outer space be conducted so as to avoid its harmful contamination and also adverse changes in the environment of Earth. This was reinforced by the United Nations Guidelines for the Long-Term Sustainability of Outer Space Activities, 2018. World governments are playing dice with life on Earth. To refuse to accept and apply relevant and valid scientific knowledge is ethically unacceptable.
We call upon the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the European Union, the Council of Europe, and governments of all nations, A, to take immediate measures to halt the deployment of 5G on Earth and in space in order to protect all humankind. B, inform citizens, including teachers and physicians, about the health risks to adults and children from RF radiation and why they should and how they can avoid wireless communication and base stations. C, to favor and implement wired telecommunications instead of wireless. D, to prohibit the wireless telecommunications industry through its lobbying organizations from persuading officials to make decisions permitting further expansion of RF radiation. And E, to appoint immediately, without industry influence, international groups of independent, truly impartial EMF and health scientists with no conflicts of interest for the purpose of establishing new international safety standards for RF radiation. And F, to appoint immediately, without industry influence, international groups of scientists with expertise in EMFs, health, biology, and atmospheric physics for the purpose of developing a comprehensive regulatory framework that will ensure that the use of outer space is safe for humans and the environment. Not only ground-based, but also space-based technology must be sustainable for adults and children, animals and plants. Please respond to the appeal administrator listed below, detailing the measures you intend to take to protect the global population against RF radiation exposure, especially 5G radiation. This appeal and your response will be publicly available on www.5gspaceappeal.org. Respectfully submitted, Arthur Furstenberg, Appeal Administrator, and his email is info@5gspaceappeal.org. This appeal is to be delivered in its totality to the United States Permanent Mission to the United Nations in behalf of New York City 5G Wake-Up Call. It's approximately 2 p.m., January 24th, 2020.
You're going to do it now?
Yeah.